Welcome to RuralStrong, where we talk real challenges and bold solutions in rural economic development. I'm your host, Joe Barker. Let's get into it. This is your podcast host, Joe Barker, and we're coming to you from the Southwest Tennessee Development District podcast studio in beautiful downtown Jackson, Tennessee. And we have a treat today. We have Dr. Lisa Piercey, and I know many of you recognize that name. She's a physician executive, a pediatrician, an entrepreneur, an author, and she previously served as the commissioner for the Tennessee Department of Health from 2019 to 2022. Dr. Lisa, welcome to RuralStrong.
Thanks, Joe.
Well, you know, this is a lady that's background is unbelievable. She's done a lot of things and been successful at everything that she has done. And we've got several things we want to talk about today. But I want to start off by, I guess, talking a little bit about you served as Commissioner of Health in the state of Tennessee during probably the most difficult period you could have served, and that was during the COVID pandemic. So I'd just like to get your thoughts on that experience and what you took from that you take as you move forward in your life.
Well, the running joke is the governor tricked me into doing it. But in all reality, it wasn't a trick because people forget, and I tend to forget, we had over a year in office together before the pandemic. He was inaugurated in January of 2019, and he asked me to join the cabinet because he had run on a platform of rural issues, economic development, workforce, but not healthcare. And he was very upfront. He said, look, I think we have a rural healthcare problem in Tennessee. People tell me you're the rural hospital girl. Why don't we work on this together? And so it was not only a huge honor, but it was something I was very passionate about. And for the first 13, 14 months, that's what we did. We worked on rural health care, we worked on opioids, dental care for the uninsured, and then March 4th, 2020 was our first case, and the rest of the first term was just pandemic management.
Well, and you know, we all know the challenges that came with that, and I thought you handled it really well, and I sometimes I would watch you on TV as you gave your updates, and I would think to myself, I sure am glad I'm not having to make those kinds of decisions. But you mentioned rural health care, and our audience have a lot of folks that live in rural areas. We have many rural elected officials, economic developers, and let's talk a little bit about the state of rural health care, not only in Tennessee, but across the country in our rural areas. So give me a little bit of your thoughts on where we are today with rural health care.
Sure, and if it's okay, I'll give you a brief background because I think it is really important context of where I'm coming from here. I am a first-generation college graduate. I'm the daughter of a fifth-generation farmer. So rural, to me, is home. It's everything. I didn't wake up in New York City one day. You can tell by the way I talk, I'm not from New York City, but I didn't wake up one day saying, oh, that's a good place to invest, or that's somewhere I can make a difference. It's meaningful to me. And what I have seen, not only in my professional life, but in my personal life, is that there's now somewhat of a mismatch of what is available in rural areas for healthcare versus kind of what we really need. And it just shows kind of a shift in policy and just shift in society. And it goes back to probably the early 50s and the Hill-Burton Act, where there was a ton of federal investment in infrastructure. And people will recognize this as soon as I say it. There was a little hospital in every community. I'm from Gibson County, and there were 3 hospitals. Not that long ago, I'm talking 10, 12 years ago, there were still hospitals in Trenton, Humboldt, and Milan. That's probably not sustainable at all. I mean, and we probably knew that in the 80s, 90s, but we held on to that. And I think there's it's very complicated why we've held on to that. One is very real, practical emergency services. Yes, your outcomes are going to be worse if you have to go 35 minutes versus 5 minutes in an emergency. Absolutely. But I'm also empathetic to local mayors and leaders who are faced with the possibility of closing a hospital or closing a service under their watch, when in reality, this was a holdover from the 50s and 60s where people didn't drive more than 5 or 10 miles. And there were family doctors who did it all. They delivered babies and took your gallbladder out and did a breast biopsy and took care of you if you had a heart attack. Now, there's so much specialization that there are specialists for all of that and specialized medications. And it's just not sustainable to think that a small rural community like Trenton or Humboldt or any of them could sustain a cardiologist, a kidney doctor, an OBGYN, et cetera.
And the other thing, Dr. Lisa, is that rural hospital is a major employer in that small community. And when that rural hospital shuts down, then you lose population, you lose a lot of educated people that are important to your education system. There's ripple effects from this.
There's a huge ripple effect, and particularly the communities that I'm familiar with, it's almost always the largest employer. It might employ 60, 80, 100 people. Not only do you have that job loss and the loss of the brain trust, if you will, but you also get hurt from an economic development and recruiting standpoint. For example, my husband is in safety for manufacturing. And we've talked many times, they're expanding their plants. They don't want to put a plant somewhere where they don't have a hospital. If somebody had a work-related accident, they need emergency services right there in town. And so the ripple effect goes far beyond just the loss of jobs.
Is there an answer to the rural hospital situation? And you mentioned the local elected officials. It is one of the most pressing issues that they have, and as our population gets older and older, then the demand gets greater and greater.
That's right. I sort of think about this like Facebook says, it's complicated. And there's not just one answer. If there were one answer, we would have done it already. It's really a series of things that can be done. Probably the most important is tailoring services in a community to what the community is using. Oftentimes, that's emergency services, outpatient imaging services, mammogram, x-ray, and then lab services. Sometimes it's also physical therapy, those more ancillary and wraparound services. What it's often not are inpatient beds. But there's this, dig my nails in, I'm going to hold on to this to the very last minute. And I think that is bleeding these facilities and these communities dry, whereas if they shifted a little bit earlier, then it could have been more sustainable. Now, having said that, some of that is on the policy side. Some of that would have already been done had the policy allowed it, federal policy and state policy. But also, let's say something that's very important here, is reimbursement policy. Because the law may allow it, but if they can't get paid for it, if insurance companies don't pay for it, then it's a moot point. And so that's why I joke that it's complicated, because it kind of takes movement in all of those pieces to make for a good outcome. I think we're getting there, but we've still got a ways to go.
Now, earlier in your career, you worked for a large regional hospital. What is the role of regional hospitals in the dilemma that's in our rural areas?
Great question. So I tell you what people think is happening when a regional healthcare system goes out into rural communities. Oh, you're just trying to steal our patients and bring them all to fill in the blank centralized area. Actually, what is happening is they're trying to help tailor those services in the community that can be provided there sustainably. We're not going to do cardiac caths out in a rural community. But what we can do, or we can do some cardiac screenings, and we can take care of some basic cardiac issues. And so the regional health systems are trying to support those rural communities in what they can sustain, and then having a place to offload the more acute, the sicker, the more specialized care to a centralized facility, and having those what are called transfer agreements in order to take them in, because I don't want to poison the well here, but in some communities there are those larger systems who don't necessarily want rural patients because their payer sources aren't as strong.
Well, and we saw this during COVID when where we're sitting today, the community where we're sitting today, that the people in the rural areas, they flooded the hospital here, and the people that lived in this community, many of them didn't have beds, which, creates a real dilemma for those people in healthcare.
It does. And, you've mentioned it earlier, but the thing to remember is in rural areas, the patients are usually older, they're sicker, and often poorer. And so what happens when they don't have access in those rural communities is they wait and they wait. And then they get to a point where they can't wait any longer. And so then they're very sick and they have to go to a more centralized area that has those specialized services. Whereas if they had access in their community, and access means more than just facility. It means affordability. It means the clinicians and the right professionals are there. If they have that access in the community, they get taken care of earlier, which means their outcomes are better and their cost is less.
Okay, you've sort of transitioned now, Dr. Lisa, from being Commissioner of Health and your previous role at West Tennessee Healthcare. Tell our listeners what Dr. Lisa Piercey is focused on today.
Yeah, it's a pretty hard pivot, but man, it's fun. So when I came out of government around the time Governor Lee was reelected to his second term, I, like many, kind of had one of these moments where it's like, well, if I'm going to do something, now is the time to do it. There's an inflection point here. And oddly, I was the only person in my family who didn't pursue an entrepreneurial path. Saying that a different way, I was the only person who had ever worked in any type of corporate setting. And I thought, well, maybe I'm just a slow learner, and maybe this is the time for me to go do my own entrepreneurial thing. And so I did initially, like many people do, I launched a startup. I launched a consulting business. It went very, very well, very quickly, and I didn't care for it at all because I realized what I wanted to do as an entrepreneur is decouple my time and my income. I wanted to be able to have income without having to put hour by hour by hour in. The way you do that is through business ownership. And you can do that through a startup, but I wasn't willing to wait the 3, 5, 6 years. Plus, I had 4 kids at the time, all about to start college. So I really couldn't take that kind of income hit. So I became familiar with buying businesses and educated myself on that. I bought one, and I thought, this is working pretty good. So I've ended up buying a couple more and working on my 4th one now.
Now, are the businesses you look at, are they mainly in the healthcare field?
They're all healthcare. That's all I know about. And that's actually a pretty hot topic in the business buying world. One camp says, like me, do what you know. Leverage your network, your skill set, all of that to really do well in buying businesses. The other camp, which is also pretty vocal, which is business. And if you really know how to operate a business, you can go out here and buy an HVAC company or a laundromat or an accounting services. And for me, I didn't want to give up the 20 or so years of the network and the nuance that I had learned. I wanted to leverage that. So all of my acquisitions have been healthcare.
Okay, let's relate this to our rural areas a little bit. I'm a huge believer that in a lot of our rural communities that struggle to create jobs, that those jobs that are created locally and by those entrepreneurs that have a startup and build it from the ground up. But those folks, when they grow their business, they tend to stay at home. And can this model you're looking at about purchasing maybe an undervalued asset there, what's your thoughts on how that would work in a rural area?
I think it's key to keeping things local because what we're seeing is, and you see this overused almost too much, the gray tsunami or the silver tsunami of the baby boomers who are all aging out of those family businesses that they built, started, and have probably operated for 25, 35 years. And so what is the natural succession of that? One is, do they have a family member who, a child, an adult child, nephew, whatever, that wants to take over it? Now in rural areas, most of those people have moved. They're gone. So that number one most common thing, that's gone, and family can't go. The employees don't want to buy it. Every now and then you get that, but usually there's not anybody in-house. And then the other option is to just close it down. And unfortunately, we see that in our communities. And it's not dissimilar to what we just talked about, what happens when a hospital closes. When a decent-sized business closes, then you've got people leaving the community, people are out of work. And so I think buying businesses is one of the key ways to sustain the economic footprint in a rural community. People think it's really difficult. And I don't want to downplay the risk or the kind of consequence involved, but it can be done, it can be done well, and it's very important to get done.
Well, and those businesses that you're talking about, they're in all our rural communities. And as you said, we had a family business that I grew up in. All the children left, and then when I decided that maybe I wanted to take a different path, really the option was you just pretty much close the business down. And then I look, there were several jobs that were lost locally, those people that had worked there for years, and you had developed those relationships. So how do you get access to capital to do something like this? If if you're looking at that business that you have in your mind, that this is something that could be built up, could create jobs in our community, what's your advice on finding capital?
Yeah, that's obviously the number one concern of everybody. And I'm also sensitive to the fact that people kind of shut me down when I talk about this and say, well, I don't have X number of $1 million in the bank. I can't just go buy these things. Oh, nobody does. I mean, that's not how people buy businesses. Probably the number one way that people buy small businesses is through an SBA loan. The SBA will loan you, in many cases, up to 90 or even more than 90% of the purchase price. You have to figure out with yourself, your family, your accountant, if that makes sense for you to take out that much debt. But the SBA, the Small Business Administration, wants these businesses to stay in small communities. They want individual entrepreneurs to continue them, so they incentivize, the federal government incentivizes that, the purchase through SBA loan. There's also traditional bank loan. There, you can use some of your savings. You can even come up with some creative financing through the seller, what's called a seller note or seller financing. You can pay the seller over time. And then when you get into larger businesses, like the ones I'm buying now, you can raise money from investors. You can do things through SBIC funds and other kind of larger incentive programs in order to do that. And so the bottom line is you don't have to have money in the bank, tons of money in the bank to do that. You need to have some skin in the game. I'm not one of these, and you see influencers out there these days. I'm not one of these, no money down, go buy this. I think that's irresponsible because this is a very serious and significant decision, probably the biggest purchase you'll ever make, but there's plenty of ways to finance it.
Is there a way that local government can get involved in this process to encourage this in their community, that, some way that they promote this to keep those businesses alive? Is there a way to do that?
That's a great question. I think the main way to do that is through education. Not only education and awareness of, hey, this business is probably coming on the market. This business is looking for a buyer. And I realize that's a sensitive subject sometimes. You have to tread lightly there. But also, and I've spoken with a local chamber here in West Tennessee about doing some education on just what we were talking about. Okay, I have identified a business that I might like to buy. What now? Like, how do I do that? And, I talk about in the book, people want to make an analogy of, I've bought a house. It's probably like buying a house, but it's not. It's very different. And if you're not prepared for the differences, you're probably going to have a failed process and maybe even lose money in it. So I think that's what local chambers and municipalities can do, is educate people. Not only there's opportunity here, but here's how you get it done.
All right, you mentioned your book, Natural Born Entrepreneurs Breaking into Business Ownership. Now, how did Dr. Lisa get in the book business?
Good question because, I didn't wake up one day and say, I'll write a business book, but I have always appreciated writing. For me personally, it helps me think better. The people I work with hear me say that all the time, like, I need to write this out. That's how my brain works the best. And so I've had just had a desire to write for several years. And I thought, well, I'll write about politics because clearly, as you've already mentioned, I had a lot of political history to write about during the pandemic. And I thought, well, that's not going to age very well. And, it's just so polarizing. And frankly, I lived through that. I don't want to live through it again by writing it. That chapter's closed. And so I didn't want to write about that. And I thought, well, what better to write about is healthcare? I mean, even rural healthcare. And that would have been fine. I just kind of felt like it was a drop in the bucket. And so I was going through this first acquisition, and my very first investor, I was talking to him about all the starts and stops we had in the process. And he said, I was telling him about the latest trouble that I had had. And he said, oh, you need to write a book about that. And I remember I was out for a walk and I just stopped walking and I thought, yeah, that's what I need to do. And so I literally just started writing the book that I wish I'd had. There are a couple of pretty respected business buying books on the market, but they're very strongly geared towards what I call 26-year-old MBAs who've just graduated from Yale or Stanford. I wrote it specifically for a mid-careerist without an MBA, without a finance degree, in plain language. It's not rocket science, but there are some special concepts and special terms you have to know.
Okay, this is a question I've always wanted to ask someone that's written a book. How do you begin that process? Because, I talk to people all the time and say, I'd like to write a book. I'd like to write a book. How do you start?
This phrase comes to mind, and it's not appropriate for your show, so I'll substitute a word that some advice I was given. You just got to get the crappy first draft down first, which it is essentially you have to tell yourself the story. I think people, and I felt the pull to it as well, people want it right, and they go back and they edit, and I don't like how that went, and I don't like... Just put the words down and tell yourself the whole story and then go back and edit it. And for me personally, I'm a big fan of tiny habits. If I can do just a little something every day, that's better to me than something big 2 or 3 times a week. And so I set a goal to write 200 words a day. And sometimes 200 words came out in 10 or 11 minutes before I had my coffee in the morning. Sometimes it took an hour to get it out, but I was going to get 200 words a day. And so doing it that way, it took me about a year to write. I'll tell you the other thing that I did that I see a lot of people kind of getting hung up on is they think they have to have the title first and then they start. And the title was literally one of the very last things that came. And it was with help too, because I'm a scientist. I'm not very creative.
How's the response been to your book?
It's been great. I knew there would be the usual suspects of business buyers and those 26-year-olds who, are looking for more resources. And I have a fair number of people who are sort of the same stage of life as me, 15, 20 plus years. Like, I don't think I want to work in this corporate environment for another 20 years. I want to do something different, but I either don't have a startup idea or I can't tolerate the lifestyle change that a startup will require. So those have been pretty typical responses. The thing I haven't, that I didn't really anticipate, I've had a big international response. And I guess their problems across the pond are the same as ours. They have aging business owners and now looking for the next phase. And so it's been very well received. LinkedIn has been a key piece of that for me because that's where that business community is. And so I strongly recommend that.
I know this is a relatively new book. But have there been any folks that has read your book that you've heard from and said this really spurred me on to do something? Have you heard any of those stories yet?
I've heard a few of them. It's been out almost 60 days. And I've had a few people, what I'm hearing now is, I didn't think there was another option for me. I thought my two options were stay in this corporate job or launch a startup. I'd never considered this third path. And in fact, I get that. I get a lot of people coming to me saying, hey, do you know of any jobs that are open in your companies? Or you know a lot of people, do you have a role? And when I tell them, like, have you ever considered buying a business? And I just get this blank look, like, I don't know where to start. And so a lot of the responses that I've gotten, both directly and indirectly, like through Amazon reviews, is this really opened my eyes to a third option that I didn't know existed.
That's great. I have great respect for anyone that has the discipline to write a book. You know, we were talking about COVID, and I've told people that, you know, when we were like most businesses and we shut down and went home and worked from home, I would tell my wife, if my employees are as bad at doing this at home as I am, we're in bad trouble in our organization. But I encourage everyone, natural-born entrepreneurs, and again, I know it's on Amazon. Where else can folks find this book?
Amazon, Barnes & Noble, Target, and then the Audible book is on Audible, Spotify, Apple Music, all the places where you get your podcast.
There you go. Well, great. In just a couple of minutes we've got left, looking back at your career, and I do this all the time, is there anything that you might do differently, that you might change, or that for somebody out there that's listening that can learn from that experience that maybe, you know, you would take a little different path on? Anything like that?
I think a lot of people might have the same thought that I do about the earliest days of my career. When I came straight out of medical school, out of residency, man, I just wanted a job. I had a growing family. I needed good, strong income. I wish I had learned more about the business side at that point, because I had trained in, if you will, a trade, a skill. I knew how to be a doctor. And I loved being a doctor, but I think I missed that interplay of doing my trade and finding out the business impact of it. And I don't think I'll ever go back into full-time practice again, but I wish I had viewed my clinical practice more in the business lens, because that's ultimately what my career has turned into. As far as the career path that I have taken, man, I couldn't have predicted that. If you had told me it would have happened like that, I would have called you all kinds of liar and silly and all of that. But I can't imagine a better outcome. I am thrilled to do what I do. And so that would be my parting advice is, don't be afraid to pivot and take what you've learned and then kind of tweak it and do something better the next time.
I know my dad told me when I ran for my first political office, and I was about halfway through the campaign, and he pulled me off to the side and he says, you know, son, I could have sent you to Harvard and not get you the education you're about to get. What's the biggest takeaway from your time?
Facts don't change people's minds. And that was the biggest takeaway of the pandemic for me, which is, as a scientist, and doctors do this all the time, we look at evidence and we say, okay, we understand the principles under which this outcome was tested. We believe it. That's what we're going to do. And so during the pandemic, in those early days, when we would put facts before people, this causes this is what you can do to help mitigate it, X, Y, Z, and it was met with just sheer resistance, I thought, oh, wait, I must not be saying this, fill in the blank, clearly enough, loudly enough, mean enough to get people's attention. So I need to say this louder or clearer. And that didn't work either, because it was the learning that people would rather fit into their tribe, however you define that, than to be right. And so if believing a certain fact set causes them to be ostracized from their tribe, and you can define tribe as the family, the political persuasion, their religious community, their geography, whatever, then they would rather fit in than be right. And that was a pretty hard pill to swallow, no pun intended.
All right. You've gotten just a small taste of Dr. Lisa Piercey and her knowledge today, and if you're out there and I can tell you she's a great speaker. If you're looking for a keynote speaker, anything in that realm,
I've got a
how can they
contact
get a
me
hold of
site
you?
on my website, lisapiercey.com, lisapiercey.com.
All right, Dr. Lisa Piercey has been our guest,
Thanks so much, Joe.
And we appreciate the time. Thanks for joining us on Rural Strong. If you found this helpful, share it, and follow the show for more insights from rural leaders making a real difference. Until next time, stay rural strong.